All right, so first, I'm Cameron Kunzelman. Who am I? Who and why am I? So I'm a 2CI fellow in New and Emerging Media over at Georgia State University. I primarily study the philosophy of media, primarily philosophy of new media, contemporary stuff, video game studies. I'm a game critic. I write fairly often for Paste Magazine. I've been writing on the internet about games for 5-6 years now. I make art games. That was in quotation marks in a previous version, and also had UG in parameters, or parentheses beside it. But that's what I do. So I don't make roguelikes, but I care about roguelikes. I play quite a few roguelikes, and so this is me kind of giving some top-down design ideas about them. I like narrative UG again. And I write for other games occasionally, and I'm fun to be around, and I like to goof it up. All right, so the Artisanal Roguelike. This morning I'm going to be talking about the Artisanal Roguelike, a title that I chose as a complete and utter joke because the idea of artisanal rocking chairs and canned goods is infinitely funny to me, and I wanted to share that joy with you. On the other hand, and there's always another hand, I actually do want to say something about handcrafting and particular kinds of content generation within the broad genre that we generally refer to as the roguelike. What follows is going to be a rambly airplane-level view of some design ideas behind roguelikes, followed by some assertions about how narrative and how traditional written narrative could fit into the broad frame of the more traditional roguelike genre. I'm calling this explicitly written content within the roguelike frame the artisanal roguelike because, as I said, I find the phrase both very funny and yet actually descriptive of a particular kind of ethic in game design. So with all that said, I'll begin. The act of creating a roguelike is generally the act of creating a piece of machinery that then provides the backbone for generating a game. As we've seen from the developers who spoke yesterday, or as you saw, because I wasn't here, because I was hungover until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, is an act of intentional design and redesign. It's actually pretty similar to how Karl Marx talked about industrial machines for factory work. He said that they were created and existed as dead labor, while claiming that they were merely an encapsulation of all the work time that went into them. For Marx, machines of all sorts are a bit like Han Solo, frozen there, and they allow you to get a jump on future labor because they make it easier. They are an investment of time and energy into a concrete form that allows you to subtract production time from the creation of a future product. And this is a really haphazard explanation of what Marx said, but my point is that the machinery that one creates when one is making a roguelike helps save a lot of time in the future through the ability to auto-magically create an extensive amount of content, situations, objects, qualities, and so on. So one can be really fancy and purposeful, like this picture, when one is creating that initial machinery, and one can always hone that code and change the design and generally be responsive to player feedback or your own design demons or whatever makes you move in the world. That kind of procedural content generation generally does a great job of creating objects and creating qualities that get applied to those objects. Creating a class of weapons and then applying different adjectives, color palettes, and descriptive data from databases is largely an automated and infinitely extendable endeavor once you have the basic operational structure in place. And this becomes extendable to locations, as locations are merely made of objects, and so the same basic process that allows you to create a fire stick of goblin poking +1 also allows you to create a swamp tile with a piece of broken pottery on it that slows movement speed, right? So it's a similar kind of process in a top-down way. Roguelikes as a genre are fundamentally built around the creation of these kinds of objects, and more importantly, how the player or computer-controlled characters smash those objects into one another. The Berlin interpretation sort of hinges on this to the exclusion of all other forms of interaction. However, these same procedural tools do not often give way to creating useful or engaging narratives, or really any kind of narrative at all, beyond something of the go to floor X, kill big bad Y, and return to zone Z. We can see that most explicitly in a game like Dungeons of Dreadmore, which really tries to ride on its humor but delivers functionally nothing in a narrative sense beyond the occasional generated quest or item and its ability in item descriptions. And so Dreadmore has the particular in-game automatic quest generation that automatically picks an item in a lower floor and asks you to go get it and bring it back to a statue. It's a particular example. So to see how these methods can be used to their most extreme end, we can of course look to the world of AAA development, and they actually point to some kind of transposable strengths and weaknesses of that kind of content creation. So one is the Nemesis system from Shadows of Mordor. It is, from a top-level procedural design perspective, seemingly not very complicated in that you're giving an object a series of qualities that get fetched from what is functionally a spreadsheet. And another is the Radiant Quest system from Skyrim, which matches locations up. This is from the, I think, the Skyrim wiki explanation of the Radiant system. So another is the Radiant Quest system from Skyrim, which matches locations up with objects in order to force you to go places and get things or kill enemies for an amount of experience and gold that gets determined via level. So it's actually not very dissimilar from the Dungeons of Dreadmore model as far as using procedural methods that might be akin to a roguelike to create narrative content. So last year, Tanya X. Short in an interview with Christian Nutt for Gama Sutra, where she said, quote, "I think every designer now has to ask themselves at the start of any game project these days, is there any way I can procedurally generate any of my content without the quality suffering enormously? Any answers to the affirmative must be taken seriously. The value to cost ratio is just too high." And I think we can see in the case of Skyrim and the Radiant system and in the case of the Nemesis system that happened in AAA development in those locations, right? They thought, what can we use in order to make it more engaging or to create content? And they pulled it functionally out of roguelike design. Okay, so the Nemesis system and the Radiant Quest system are both clearly designed decisions made on that basis. Open world games are constantly plagued by the player feedback that there are large gaps in content at generating things to do in the Mordor wastes, and the Snowy Forest is a way to fill that world with a little bit of something if you don't have the development time resources of Ubisoft. And it's also interesting to kind of see the flip side of this. This is a side note to this, but The Witcher 3 came out, right, a week ago, and there's this large complaint that it's missing the kind of procedurally generated content that we see in Skyrim, that it's kind of a wasteland with quests in it. And so we've already seen AAA, or expectations of AAA games shift to, we need procedurally generated content in there for people to feel like they're not wasting their time. That's an aside to the talk, but I think it's a super interesting thing that's happened. So I'm going to leave that slide up there. So procedural generation excels at what it's able to do, and what it's able to do is fairly well defined outside of particular experimental methods that are generally confined to the academic world. So Nick Montfort's work or D. Fox Harrell's work, both at MIT. Procedural generation helps to create systems that dynamically mash up against one another in fun and interesting ways, and that's primarily what roguelikes are all about in some ways. In the same interview I quoted above, Daniel Cook says, one or two person teams can't afford to make 100 hours of sexy 3D story time, but they can make 100 hours of roguelike bliss. In the case of Skyrim or Shadows of Mordor, the developers and publishers both want and need to have it both ways. They want 30 hours of 3D story time. This is just Super Mario. Or Mario 64. It's great. I've given an entire talk just about this GIF. This is not a GIF, this is a picture from it, but great stuff. But anyway, so they want 30 hours of 3D story time and an infinite amount of procedural bliss tacked onto that 3D story time in order to continually hold on to the 10% of players who will play with the machine until it dies a screaming death, right? So there's still people playing Skyrim outside of actual quest content. You're still doing the Radiant Quest system. You gotta kill those bandits. They're not gonna get out of that cave. What? Do you want to fight, Brian? Okay. So away from the AAA space, we don't see nearly as much of that ebb and flow between manual content creation and procedurally generated content as icing on the cake. The artisanal work that gets done in the independent sphere is mostly in the creation of the algorithmic system itself, with little done in the way of purposeful narrative beats. So the artisanal roguelike here is not just the creation of a beautiful system that then creates beautiful results of things smashing into one another. The artisanal roguelike is instead a roguelike that focuses on its systems as much as it does on purposeful, manually created narrative content. So I have my biases here, especially since I mostly make narrative games that don't have any kind of procedural generation. I make very singular narratives. Some people even make very singular systems for generating things. And when Darius Kazemi breaks down Spelunky, and if you haven't seen Darius Kazemi's breakdown of the Spelunky generation algorithm, it's an app that someone talked about yesterday. Okay, excellent. That's what I get. It's amazing. And Darius, I wish Darius, when you watch this later, I wish you were here. He was really sad that he didn't hear about it in time. But, so I don't want to draw these two modes of content creation into a dichotomy with one another, and I definitely don't want to suggest that there's some kind of weird moralism in one being better than the other. So I don't think that purposeful narrative content is somehow the most beautiful way to make a game, right? I just want to point out that the Artisanal Roguelike, one that is handcrafted all around, both algorithmically and purposefully narratively, might need to shore up grand narrative design with some good old-fashioned wordsmithing from a human being, or just a really smart machine. So I want to think about how narrative gets delivered. I just needed a filler slide. In a roguelike, by thinking through some broad patterns in contemporary design. So I work in philosophy of media, and so I spend a lot of time doing some big picture top-down readings of objects, and I want to take a deep dive into what makes roguelikes so compelling, and how manually written narratives can serve to shore up weaknesses and bolster strengths. So I'll talk about that by talking about another thing, and I call it the Dark Souls drive. Dark Souls is not a roguelike, I'm not making that mistake, but I think it actually does tell us something very interesting that can be applied in a minute. So bear with me as I talk about Dark Souls. So I call it the Dark Souls drive. Dark Souls, if you're unaware, is a third-person action game developed by From Software that takes design cues from far outside the generally agreed-upon parts of that genre. So despite sharing a lot of being a 3D action game, it is nothing like Uncharted, for example, which I guess is, or The Last of Us. So Dark Souls presents the player with a vast connected world that has a number of bonfires which need to be kindled by the player. Kindling those fires serves as a progress checkpoint, and your progress in the game is measured by the bosses that you have defeated in the bonfires you've kindled, so they become this sort of measuring mark. Between these bonfires are sets of enemies, and if you die to these enemies, you come back to life at the bonfire. The enemies also come back to life. You try to navigate them again, and you probably won't succeed. But if you do, then you'll make it to the next bonfire, then repeat until the end of the game, right? So they become these sort of mile markers. The drive in the Dark Souls drive is a way of creating a game that seems to have many qualities in kind with roguelikes, but actually has little in common with them. And so people, especially in like the sort of games criticism sphere, in reviews, particularly of Dark Souls, would point to roguelikes and say that that Dark Souls shares a lot of design ethics. So the idea of working on the player as this sort of location of knowledge, of discipline, all these different things. So it's not about leveling up your character so much as it's about learning the best way to do things. But it has very little in common with them. It's about creating an obtuse punishing system in which player knowledge will eventually solve out any problem. People outside of roguelike fan bases will append a like to the end, generating a roguelike like, and suggest that there's some sort of family resemblance between the games, but there's a wide field of difference. Dark Souls is like chess. It's a solved game. There's an optimal strategy for every single moment of the game. The mechanics and the objects in the game are placed in a particular way in the world, and you can approach them in a perfect way, and playing in that perfect way means you will succeed. Dodge, rolling, striking from a distance, and blocking become your pawns, your queen, your bishops, and knowing which way to move to counter certain enemy formations mean you can theoretically master the game through an intense educational study, because there's no random variables involved in the act of playing Dark Souls if you control for player variation. So if you play Dark Souls enough, you can play it like a machine, and it's solved out. There's a finite way to play it. In a finite number of scenarios you can find yourself in. So it'd be easy to map Dark Souls on a gradient between manual and procedural content, and to blame the differences between Dark Souls and, say, Dungeons of Dreadmore again, on the way that the designers initially planned how the universe would come to be created. So we could make this sort of arbitrary distinction and say that the problem with Dark Souls and the reason it isn't is interesting or whatever as a roguelike is that it is all manually placed and not procedurally. So we can imagine the purist's words. This is Barnum Krog. We can imagine purist's words. If only we have procedurally generated Dark Souls, that would truly be the game to play because of goodness and great gameplay and mechanical purity and whatever. So this is a bad opinion. Or whatever, mate. Yeah, he's Australian. But it really has very little to do with the method of creation. It isn't about the mode of production, but instead about the mode of experience. And really, weirdly enough, while I was doing the research for this, I found that there are lots of people who are attempting to crowdfund the procedural Dark Souls, which is could be very interesting, but it's very sad to me. So instead of the gradient of manual and procedural, okay, it's the gradient of predictability and unpredictability. In his Uncertainty in Games grade, Kostikian points to the indeterminacy of NetHack and roguelikes in general to suggest that randomness and unpredictable outcomes are what drive those games, and I generally agree. What makes roguelikes interesting to me is that the combined items, objects, and locations can very often lead the player into an unwinnable scenario, where she has to look back at her choices and determine at what point she led herself into this oubliette. The interactions of these systems are fundamentally unpredictable, outside of certain parameters, and player education in many roguelikes is based around learning how to escape corners you've trapped yourself in, or how to avoid those corners entirely. So in Dark Souls, it's about learning what you have to do for the next little bit. In a roguelike, it's about learning what you shouldn't have done ever. So roguelike education is about forcing predictability on your own terms onto a system that is trying its hardest to throw you into unpredictable scenarios. Okay, so there's a lot of overhead to say. So finally, the artisanal roguelike and 3 design statements. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. He's totally rad. Especially people in this room, if you haven't read Uncertainty in Games, it's an excellent, really short read. All of the playful whatever, the MIT Press series, Jesper Juhl has one on failure, and I think there's another one that's about to come out. They're all great, really, really tight reads. Anyway. Yeah, no, I mean, the guy consistently puts out really, really excellent design analysis. But, okay, so big design statement. So the artisanal roguelike does not sublimate narrative beneath system interactions, abandons grand quests in favor of small stories, and is not afraid of manual content creation and placement. I think the June is not afraid is important. So, of course, the artisanal roguelike is already here, hiding in the closet. Or at least there are close versions that meet some of the qualities that I've outlined above. It's been around us for years, and it's either been ignored as a roguelike or its roguelike nature has been overshadowed by its brilliant additional nature as an artisanal object. So I'm going to run really quickly through some things I think are examples or sort of markers on the road to get to the artisanal roguelike, one that has particular narrative design to it. So Caves of Qud, of course. So Caves of Qud is a roguelike and depends on roguelike systems. You heard about it yesterday. But to manage its entire existence, but it has some very specific narrative core elements that remain unchanged in certain locations and story beats. It's maybe the apex of what I'm thinking about when I talk about the artisanal roguelike, in its insistence that procedural generation is merely a method to get to a dynamic world in which a story of camel people and radio-apocalyptic mayhem provides the undergirded reality of existence, right? So Caves of Qud, when you play it, it's a roguelike. It has all the factors that would go into a roguelike, but it feels like it is a method to show a world off as much as it is a game or a roguelike. And I think that's the sort of apex of what we can think of in the artisanal roguelike. So another one is FTL, another roguelike-like, but it's pretty interesting. So it has elements of the artisanal roguelike, but suffers from the Dark Souls drive in that there are a finite number of small story events that rarely depend on previous events in any narrative way. More than this, they're often solved in the sense that there's generally a strictly better strategy that one should take during any narrative event. And of course, there's the grand sin of putting us through all of this only to be forced into a boring and difficult fight with a big bad spaceship at the end. So FTL is really interesting and cool and has these micro story moments in it, but it also, all those micro story moments are there to be gamed. There's an optimal strategy. There's a strictly better move every time, to use David Sirlin's terminology. So, and then Exile Escape from the Pit. Anyone play Exile? Was that a game for anybody? That's right. Jeff Vogel that's where it's at. But so it's not a roguelike in any way, but has many of the qualities that I think would fit very well into narrative-focused roguelikes. It's cellular in that there are very few objects with dependencies across the game world, so these locations or whatever don't really need context for you to understand them. You speak to a townsperson, you know that the cave needs to be cleared out, or, whatever, and you proceed to the cave to clean it out, you find the object, you tell someone about the object, and there are all these very small quests that could be transposed really easily, I think, into a roguelike and still have actual narrative quality to them. So the small quest is over, and despite the very rudimentary things I'm describing here, the world of Exile is extremely developed through these micro interactions. It takes very little manually created writing to generate these scenarios, but we can see that manual content replacing something like the dungeon quests in Dungeons of Dreadmore is a way that would radically alter the narrative capabilities of that game. So instead of find object, take it to location Z, we could take the moments that are given to us in something like Exile Escape from the Pit and just transpose that into a roguelike. This game's kind of hard to play now, and I wouldn't suggest playing the remakes, the Avernum games. They're great, but they're not nearly as interesting, I don't think. You have to emulate Windows 98 and then play it, but they're all free at Spiderweb Software's website. So heavily encourage everyone to play that. And there are, of course, others. Sunless Sea, 80 Days, which is mostly interactive fiction, but I think shares a lot of qualities with the roguelike, and Darkest Dungeon all hit these very specific and weird desires that I have. So when you're a child, I'm going to end here. So when you're a child, there's some real indeterminacy over narratives, especially in books. And when I was in elementary school reading The Hobbit or the Dragonlance novels, which I've recently dipped back into, and they're still rad. I had a lot of anxiety over whether the characters would die. So there was this chance that they could be backed into a corner, their stories cut short, and I would be left there unmoored from the world. Now we don't have that problem. If a character has a name, has a destiny, then she's probably going to live throughout the work. That's just sort of the move that's happened over the past 20 years or so. And that's the real trauma and hook that Game of Thrones has had in people, and why so many think pieces from the first season of the TV show had a variation of the phrase, "no one is safe." We are very much not used to losing characters who have a narrative investment in, and so that's where I think the artisanal roguelike can shine in both a consumer and total work of art sense. The roguelike is singular as a genre for unapologetically backing you into an unwinnable scenario before annihilating you. And what if we had that extra level of investment of narrative, of small stories or world building, not only in mastery, but in a large sense of the player's relationship to the world? The stakes become higher, and I think the worlds get richer. So thanks, that's it. So we know that every roguelike character is going to die. Sure. Well, not every roguelike character is going to die, right? Sometimes you win the game. It's like incredibly unlikely, and it's about like player discipline and skill and things like that, but I actually think that that makes a narrative that takes that seriously that much more exciting and interesting. The idea that this is whatever the broad narrative you design, hopefully something better than, or more interesting than kill the big bad or whatever. That makes those micro stories within that much more interesting. We were talking about Sunless Sea a little while ago, and I think that's a game that does that very, very well in the sense of it's about the accumulation of micro narratives under a particular captain. That then, if your large form, whatever it is, succeeds, that becomes amazing. But you don't lose out on those sort of micro stories. And so when I'm talking about the artisanal roguelike, get rid of the grand narrative, kill the big bad, whatever. Cut that out, focus on micro stories that maybe theoretically could be procedurally generated, but they don't have to be. So Brian Buckler just said something about kind of player investment, some nonsense about player investment. Yeah, non-combat players in particular. Yeah, that's it. People get really invested if you give them lots of small opportunities to be invested beyond the sort of combat realm. I think that people take those opportunities really seriously. Okay, great. Thanks so much.